Hello, everyone. Welcome back to part 2 of the respiratory system. So last time we gave a little bit of introduction, talked about the function of the respiratory system, preparing air to get to the deeper structures of our lungs where gas exchange will actually happen. And we covered the upper part of the respiratory system. So here in part 2, we're going to be talking about the lower respiratory tract. So, before I dive into the lower respiratory tract, remember we had two ways to break up the respiratory system, anatomically or structurally, upper and lower. We also had functionally, right? We have the conducting portion, which his job is to get air from A to B and to make it clean and moist and suitable to reach those deeper structures. And then we had the second functional part of the respiratory system, which is the respiratory portion, where gas exchange is actually going to happen. Carbon dioxide will be released and oxygen will be bound. So all of the upper respiratory tract is part of the conducting portion. Most of the lower respiratory tract is also part of the conducting portion. Only the very most deep level of the lower respiratory tract will we get the structures thin enough and delicate enough for gas exchange to happen. So what I'm trying to say here is anatomically, upper and lower respiratory tract, functionally, all of the upper respiratory is part of the conducting portion, and about half or more of the lower respiratory tract is also part of the conducting. Only the very deepest layers of the lower respiratory tract are part of the respiratory portion of the respiratory system, where gas exchange actually happens. So these structures here are in the lower respiratory tract, and they're part of the conducting portion of the lower respiratory tract. They include the larynx, which is your voice box. Trachea is your windpipe. Bronchi, the two main bronchi, so your trachea is going to end, and you're going to get a one pipe to each lung. Those are called your bronchi, your main bronchi. Those then branch into things called bronchioles. Now, here in the lowest part of your lower respiratory tract, we're going to find the respiratory portion. So in these structures specifically, gas exchange is happening. So the start of the respiratory portion of the respiratory system are the structures referred to as respiratory bronchioles. So you see that respiratory, it refers to the functional part. Gas exchange does happen at respiratory bronchioles. So these structures have to have a fairly thin wall to allow gas to move. Included in the respiratory portion, we have alveolar ducts and finally alveoli. A single alveolus is one sac at the very end of the airway where gas exchange can happen. So if you need a synopsis of the next like half dozen or a dozen slides I'm going to go through, check back to this page. So this has a lot of good information. It's going to summarize like the next 10 or 15 slides. So definitely spend some time on this. You're going to need to know the epithelial tissue in each one of these structures, absolutely. But it still follows what I mentioned previously. If only air is going through, you're going to have stratified, or you might have simple columnar, or you might have simple squamous, depending on how far you go. If you have any structure that also has food passing through it, then it's going to be non-keratinized stratified squamous. So remember, in the nose, it's going to be ciliated pseudostratified in the nasal cavity because only air passes through there and you need to condition it. At the very deepest part of our lungs, in the alveolar ducts and the alveolus, we need the thinnest possible separation so we can get the best exchange of gas. That means simple squamous epithelium. But we'll go through each one of these stages and go through the details. But here, this is like the short answer. Just memorize everything on this table and you're in good shape. Okay, first up, the larynx or your voice box, right? It's going to connect your pharynx to your trachea from the space in the back of your head to your windpipe. So services for passage of air. That makes sense because this is going to be a shared space. prevents ingestion of material from entering the respiratory tract. So part of the job of the larynx is to prevent food from getting into your windpipe and causing you to choke. The larynx is the structure that's going to be responsible for vocalization, for speech. I'm going to skip the next one and come back to that. Participates in both the sneeze and cough reflex, right? So you're not only in speaking, but sneezing and coughing, your larynx is very important. Now let's stop for a second and read this one that's second to the bottom. Assists in increasing pressure in the abdominal cavity. Think about that for a second. Assisting increase in pressure in the abdominal cavity. Why might you want to do that? Well, there can be a couple reasons. One, if you're perhaps lifting something very heavy, you're going to want to brace yourself and support yourself, right? You can basically close off your larynx and then bear down on the muscles for exhalation. That stabilizes your core and gives you something to kind of brace yourself on. Anyone who is the parent of a small child, right, will know what this is or know where I'm coming at here. One of the reasons you may want to increase abdominal pressure is so you can poop, right? Anyone who's saying a little child, they make this kind of face when they're going to the bathroom in their diaper. It's because they're closing off their larynx, bearing down on their abdominal muscles as a way to increase pressure in the abdominal cavity and help have a bowel movement. So perhaps something you not have thought of before, but again, any parent of a child will recognize this action. So there you go. All right, so let's talk about the anatomy of the larynx. It is made of 9 pieces of cartilage, 3 really big ones and 3 pairs of much smaller ones. And it's going to be held together by various ligaments and muscles, but we won't go too deep into those particular structures. So here we have the larynx. This is an anterior view of the larynx. Notice we have a hyoid bone that we talked about. This is the thyroid cartilage. Here is the cricoid cartilage, and this is the trachea. Over here is a posterior view, and notice it looks quite different. Notice that the thyroid cartilage does not have a posterior half. It's just open. So the thyroid cartilage, when you look at it front on, it looks like this. You look at it from underneath, it looks like that. There is no posterior wall to the thyroid cartilage. It's just open. So if you look at it kind of like at a 45-degree angle from the side, that's the thyroid cartilage. It does not have a back wall. Also, I should point out, which tends to kind of trick some people, you see here, the cricoid cartilage is very small in the anterior view. It's very, very short. Look in the posterior view, it's actually really big. So the cricoid cartilage has kind of a wedge shape. It's really small in its anterior view, but it's really big in its posterior view. So those are 2 of the 3 big pieces of cartilage. The other one is this thing here called the epiglottis. So we're going to see what the glottis is in a second. The epiglottis is the thing that's outside of the glottis. And what the job of the epiglottis does, this is a piece of elastic cartilage that will close down over your windpipe. So every time you swallow, the food will press down on the epiglottis and ensures the food goes down your esophagus and not down your windpipe. So here are 3 big pieces of cartilage: epiglottis, thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage. Now the small ones are all shown right here. This guy here called the arytenoid or arytenoid cartilage. Sitting on top of that is this little guy here, this tiny little guy there, that's the corniculate cartilage. And a little more superior lateral, this guy up here is the cuneiform cartilage. These 3 cartilages are paired. So you have 2 cuneiforms, 2 corniculates, 2 arytenoid cartilages. So 3 times 2 is 6. Plus 1, 2, 3 is 9. So those are our 9 cartilages: epiglottis, thyroid, cricoid, cuneiform, corniculate, and arytenoid. So you may remember some of these muscles from our muscles of the anterior neck. Oh, one thing to point out is this portion of the thyroid cartilage is called the laryngeal prominence. The more common term for this is an Adam's apple. So starting, everybody has a laryngeal prominence, but usually when testosterone kicks in on puberty, that this structure will grow in size. And that's why typically, but not always, men are going to have a prominent Adam's apple while women do not, because this structure grows in response to testosterone. Okay, so the largest piece of cartilage is the thyroid cartilage. It has an anterior and lateral walls, but no posterior wall. It has that laryngeal prominence that I talked about that makes your Adam's apple, and is usually larger in men than in women because of the effects of testosterone after puberty. A completely circular piece of cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, it is underneath, it's inferior to the thyroid cartilage. And sitting superior to the thyroid cartilage is the epiglottis, right? That spoon-shaped piece of elastic cartilage that will fold down and cover the trachea so we don't take food into our windpipe. That would be bad. Every time you swallow, the epiglottis is going to fold down and cover up your trachea. Right. The three paired cartilage we talked about, arytenoid, corniculate, and cuneiform. So if we take a picture here of just looking at the piece of cartilage, right, superior view looking down, this is the thyroid cartilage. Note that the hyoid bone has been removed. We have the cricoid cartilage, which makes this complete ring. And then we have two of the three paired cartilages. This whole structure here looks almost like a whale, maybe. That's the arytenoid cartilage. That little guy sitting on top of the arytenoid cartilage is the corniculate cartilage. So these structures shown here are going to provide the foundation for the musical instrument of our voice. Ligaments that connect, that run between the thyroid cartilage and the arytenoid cartilage, these are going to be two sets. There are vocal ligaments and vestibular ligaments. So the vocal ligaments are more medial. They're more on the inside. Vestibular ligaments are lateral to them. The vocal ligaments are the structures that are actually going to vibrate and produce a sound. The ones lateral to them, on the sides of them, those are the vestibular ligaments. They do not produce sound. They're there for structural support. So, based on the actions of these muscles here, the oblique arytenoid muscles, which I'm not going to get into, not going to test you on, but that's going to cause the arytenoid cartilages to rotate, and that's going to change the tension on the vocal cords, and that will change the pitch of the sound produced. More tension, faster vibration, higher pitch and sound. The more relaxed it is, the slower the vibration, the lower the wavelength, the deeper the sound. Now, this is what the structures look like just on the cartilages. If you put the flesh on top of them, it looks a little bit different, and the names change a little bit. So the vocal cords, the vocal ligaments, I should say, the vocal ligaments are called vocal folds when they actually have the tissue sitting on top of them. So vocal fold, vestibular fold, right? And the actual space, the gap between the two vocal folds is called the rima glottitis. So the hole is the rima glottitis. The whole structure here is called the glottis. So remember, the epiglottis is the thing outside of the glottis. So when the epiglottis fold completely covers the glottis, this whole thing is the glottis. So the epiglottis prevents food from passing through the rima glottitis, entering your trachea and causing you to choke. That would be unfortunate. Now, the physiology of how these muscles work and all that kind of stuff, I will leave that for physio. Here, we're just introducing you to the structures. So vocal folds are found in the larynx, right? Inside of them are the vocal ligaments covered by a mucosal membrane, because this is where we are in the respiratory tract. The opening between the folds is the rima glottitis, right? The rima glottitis and the surrounding tissue is called glottis, right? You force air through the rima glottitis, causes the vocal folds to vibrate. That produces a sound. That sound resonates in your respiratory tract, in your trachea, in your paranasal sinuses, in your mouth, and that is the resonating chamber for the instrument that is your voice. So a lot of that, again, is just genetic. It's just anatomy. if you want to have a rich, beautiful voice and sound like, you know, a rock star or whatever, you just gotta kind of be born with it. You can do a lot with technique, but a lot of it is just something you're born with. Okay, let's move inferior to the larynx and start talking about the trachea, also known as the windpipe. So this is anterior, it's in front of the esophagus, and it will eventually end and split into two main bronchi. The trachea is, you know, not very long, 12, 14 centimeters. The structure is always propped open by these C-shaped pieces of hyaline cartilage called tracheal cartilage. That makes sense. You don't want your windpipe collapsing, because if your windpipe collapses, you choke, you can't breathe. So it's held open by these tracheal cartilages, and in between these cartilages, there's something called annular ligaments. So here we go. Thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage. This is the tracheal cartilage. The stuff in between the tracheal cartilages, the stuff in between is the annular ligament. So annual, the word annual or annulus, it means a circle, right? Because what is something that's annual? It means it happens once a year. Well, what's a year? A year is the time it takes the Earth to go all the way around the sun. So this, where that root comes from, is circular. The annular ligaments go all the way around the structure of the trachea. The tracheal cartilages do not. Remember, they have a C shape, and I should have a picture of that. So here's the trachea. Here's the esophagus behind it. That's your windpipe. That's your food pipe. Your windpipe splits into your two main bronchi, one for each lung. Now, the posterior wall of the trachea is actually a muscle, and that's called the trachealis muscle. And here in the trachea, we're going to have a ciliated pseudostratified epithelium. And again, think about it. You do not want food in your windpipe, so all you're going to have here is air, so you're going to go back to having ciliated pseudostratified, just like you had in your nasal cavity, in your nasal pharynx. So here is the picture. So this is a transverse cut across the neck. This space is the lumen of the trachea. Posterior to it, we have the lumen of the esophagus. Esophagus can close down, no problem if you're not using it. So what? Who cares? Right? This yellow thing right here, that is the tracheal cartilage, a piece of hyaline cartilage that's keeping the trachea open. Notice that it is not a circle. It makes a C shape, or in this case, I guess more of a U shape. The back wall of the esophagus is the trachealis muscle. Now, you might be wondering, well, wouldn't it make more sense just to have a continuously circular piece of cartilage keeping your trachea open? Well, not really, because this system is a little bit more efficient. Because when you do take a bite of food and you swallow it, what this does is, as the esophagus swells, that piece of food can pass through. The trachealis muscle is stretchy, and it allows the esophagus to intrude a little bit into the space of the trachea and then bounce back. So it's just kind of like a space-saving mechanism. You don't need to have two open tubes that are open all the time, because that's a big waste of space. So normally the esophagus can just remain collapsed. When you do need to pass something through it, it will expand a little bit into the lumen of the trachea, and then it will simply bounce back. And that trachealis muscle gives you flexibility to do that. So if we look at the histology here in the trachea, we're going to have mucosal membrane, ciliated pseudostratified with columnar cells, with goblet cells to make the mucus, to trap that dirt, to humidify the air, to get it ready to get down into the lungs. Right below that, we're going to have a lamina propria. That is simply a layer of connective tissue that's going to have blood vessels and things like that to help support the epithelium. Deep to that, you're going to have something called the submucosa, where you'll have other structures, different types of mucosal glands in order to make mucus for our mucosal membrane. The very end of the trachea, where it actually splits, the fork in the road, as it were, the fork in the road, that's called the carina, and that will split into the left and right main bronchus. So at this point, we'll pick up what's called the bronchial tree. So at the end of the trachea, we have the start of the bronchial tree. The first branches are the main bronchi, one for each lung. Trachea, main bronchi shown in green. Main bronchia are going to branch into things called lobar bronchi. So a lobar bronchus feeds one lobe of the lungs. So we're going to say that one lung has 3 lobes, the other lung has 2 lobes. Lobar bronchi are going to branch into segmental bronchi. Each lobe of the lung is further subdivided into different segments. So each segment of the lung is fed by one segmental bronchi. And eventually segmental bronchi are going to split into smaller and smaller bronchi. We'll just call them small bronchi. So here you can see the whole bronchial tree, from the larynx to the trachea to the main bronchus to the lobar bronchus to the segmental bronchi. Okay, so I already covered these structures. So the branching continues, and there are a couple of landmarks I want you to pay attention to. Bronchi, or bronchus, like the trachea, are propped open by pieces of cartilage. We do not want these things collapsing, which means they're not going to change their size, generally speaking. So in the bronchial tree, as you get branching and branching into smaller and smaller tubes, you're going to start getting incomplete rings of cartilage, and they'll tend to be less and less cartilage. Bronchi are all lined with pseudostratified epithelium, again for conditioning air. Bronchi eventually branch into bronchioles. Now, bronchioles are fundamentally different than bronchi. Bronchioles do not have cartilage, and they will have a thick layer of smooth muscle. Also, bronchioles tend to be lined with simple columnar or simple squamous, because as we get deeper and deeper into the lungs, the epithelium needs to get thinner and thinner and thinner to allow for gas exchange. So bronchi branch into bronchioles. Bronchioles do not have cartilage. They do have a thick layer of smooth muscle, and they tend to be less than 1 millimeter in diameter. Now, the smooth muscle in bronchioles allows them to change the diameter. So this is bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation. So bronchodilation, the smooth muscle relaxes and the bronchioles get bigger. Bronchoconstriction, right, they get smaller. You can bring less air in. Now, eventually bronchioles get smaller and smaller and smaller until they reach a structure that we call terminal bronchioles. And terminal bronchioles are noteworthy because terminal bronchioles are the last step, the very last structure in the conducting portion of the respiratory system. You take one more step, gas exchange is possible. So if you take that step, you will get into respiratory bronchioles. And in respiratory bronchioles, you do have gas exchange happening. So respiratory bronchioles mark the beginning of the respiratory portion of the respiratory system. Now, talking a little bit about bronchoconstriction, bronchodilation, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why, right? We all need oxygen. Isn't more oxygen better? And you need to remember for a second that it depends on the situation, right? Sitting here at rest, not really doing a whole lot, you don't need a lot of air, right? Would there be a downside to bringing in too much air? Sure. When you get into physio, talk about hyperventilation and throwing off blood chemistry, but I'm not going to worry about now. You can think about something a little bit easier than that. Is the air is dirty, right? If you don't need a lot of air, only bring in a small amount of air, because then your body can do a really good job at cleaning and conditioning it, so it makes it less likely for you to pick up an infection. However, if a lion is you, right, don't worry about picking up, dirt in your lungs or picking up a virus because you're about ready to be eaten by a lion. Go ahead, do your bronchodilation, bring as much air as possible. Don't worry about an infection. But if you're just hanging out, chilling, watching Netflix, what's the point of doing that, right? Don't make yourself more susceptible to infection. So in that case, bronchoconstriction is better because you can do a better job of cleaning the air. Okay, so we've reached the point where we're transitioning from the conducting portion of the respiratory system. Remember, this is the functional distinction. Conducting portion, get the air clean, get the air warm. And then the respiratory portion where we're actually going to get useful gas exchange. So what's that boundary? The end of the conducting are terminal bronchioles, shown here, terminal bronchioles, and the start of the respiratory portion are the respiratory bronchioles. Respiratory bronchioles are going to turn into alveolar ducts. Alveolar ducts are going to eventually turn into alveolar sacs, so just a dead end. Now we've come to the end of the various tubes leading from the nose and mouth down to the deepest part of our lungs. Thin walls of the alveolus are specialized to allow the exchange of gas, release of carbon dioxide, and the binding of oxygen. So what we see here, bronchiole. How do I know this is a bronchiole and not a bronchus? No cartilage, and there is smooth muscle, so I know it is a bronchiole, right? This is the last part of the bronchiole that is too thick for gas exchange, so that is the terminal bronchiole. Take one more step, respiratory bronchiole. Take the next step, you go to an alveolar duct. Alveolar duct is going to dead end into individual alveolus. Now, what this figure shows here, you're going to have elastic fibers kind of wrapped around the alveolus. So this is why your lungs kind of shrink, and then you're going to have to pull air in to fill them back up. But their natural tendency is going to want to kind of squish back down. And here we have our pulmonary capillary beds, right? Notice the color, artery, away from the heart. This is deoxygenated blood coming from the right ventricle. Pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, goes into the lungs. So it can hit the capillary bed, give up carbon dioxide, bind oxygen. It's going to change its color. What do you get? You're going to get red blood on the way back to the left atrium. So blue squirt from the right ventricle leaves as red ooze on its way back to the left side of the heart, where it will be pressurized by the left ventricle and sent out to the rest of the body. Okay, so this is a histological slide of lung tissue, and you can see some of the different structures that we've been talking about. Here is a respiratory bronchiole. You can see that the wall is relatively thin, thin enough for gas exchange. So this will eventually turn into these clear pathways. Notice these do not have thick walls. This is an alveolar duct. So it is just a hallway made up of alveoli on either side. Notice that this has a thinner wall than that. When you come down, boink, to a dead end, one of these little pockets, one pocket is an alveolus. So respiratory bronchiole leading to alveolar ducts. Once you actually dead end to one of these pockets, now you're in an alveolus. This image, this electron micrograph down here shows you a little bit more. You can see the individual alveolus, right? Where you have alveoli making the walls of the tube. That is an alveolar duct. So here's the alveolar duct. You can see the alveoli lining the walls. Take one step back structurally, you get the respiratory bronchiole. Take another step back, now we have the terminal bronchiole. Notice this is a much thicker walled structure. No gas exchange is going to happen. So this is part of the conducting portion. Over here is part of the respiratory portion of the respiratory system. Okay, so let's talk about the structure down in the alveoli. So the wall of the alveolus, the little air pocket inside our lungs, the deepest part of our lungs, is made up of a couple different types of cells. The first type are what are called alveolar type 1 cells. Alveolar type 1 cells they make up a simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous, so they're very, very thin to allow gas to exchange. In addition, we're going to have type 2 alveolar cells. So type 2 cells produce something called pulmonary surfactant. So what pulmonary surfactant is it's a little bit like a detergent. And what it does is it breaks surface tension. So what am I getting at here? So if you've maybe ever done laundry and you have some delicate piece of fabric and it gets wet, right? The two pieces of delicate fabric want to stick together. Right? That's because of surface tension of water, right? You have to kind of peel them apart. If you bring them close to each other, they'll just stick together again. Well, the exact same thing will happen in your lungs. What normally wants to happen, because this super thin layer of squamous cells is covered in mucus, this stuff wants to stick together. That's bad. That's what a collapsed lung is. Your lungs should normally spontaneously collapse. Boom. All those alveoli should just stick together because of all this mucus. The reason it doesn't happen, type 2 alveolar cells producing pulmonary surfactant. The pulmonary surfactant breaks the surface tension of the walls of the alveolus and keeps the alveolus open, prevents your lungs from collapsing. So super important to the functioning of your lungs. Also down in this area, you're going to have another type of cell called an alveolar macrophage. The old term for this is the dust cell. Basically, your conducting portion of the respiratory system does a very, very good job of keeping pathogens and bacteria out. By the time you're way down in the alveolus, the air should be sterile. If, however, any bacteria or debris gets down there, alveolar macrophages are there to clean it up and get rid of the stuff. Now, generally speaking, your upper respiratory tract is filled with bacteria. It's just teeming, millions of different kinds of bacteria living up there in a normal, healthy individual, right? The lower and lower you get in the respiratory tract, those numbers become less and less and less. And in a healthy individual, the respiratory portion of the respiratory tract should be sterile, right? All that hair, all the mucus, all the nasal turbinates, the pharyngeal tonsils, all that stuff has done its job in purifying the air. So by the time it gets way down deep to the alveolus, the air is sterile. And that's important because if you were to take all the alveoli and just lay it out on a flat surface area, each lung is about the size of a tennis court, right? So if you were to take the surface area of your lungs, each lung, right, flattened out is the size of a tennis court. That is a huge piece of land. It is, I mean, it's a huge area. And it's also an incredibly thin membrane that's super easy for pathogens to enter your body through that space. So that's why it's so important we have the conducting portion of a respiratory system to filter out all those bacteria and pathogens and dust before it gets down to this very large and very sensitive area. Okay, so now we can talk about a structure called the respiratory membrane. Now, the respiratory membrane is actually three structures put together. Part of it is made by those type 1 alveolar cells. Part of it is made by the endothelium of the pulmonary capillaries, so the walls of the blood vessels, and they will actually share a common basement membrane. So the respiratory membrane is a diffusion barrier, blood on one side, air inside your lungs at the other, where carbon dioxide is released from the blood, enters the air, oxygen from the air enters the blood. Right, so the structure is made of the plasma membrane of the type 1 alveolar cells, a basement membrane shared between the type 1 alveolar cells, and the capillary endothelium, the plasma membrane of the endothelial cells. Getting a little bit lost? Let's go to the picture. So this is one alveolus. Its walls are created by the type 1 alveolar cells, right? Running along those cells, we have pulmonary capillaries. And if you remember, capillaries, simple squamous endothelium, one layer of cells, kind of these little guys with little spiky things on their head, those are type 2 alveolar cells producing pulmonary surfactant to prevent the alveolus from collapsing. Alveoli tend to be connected to each other through structures called alveolar pores. This is just how air gets in and out of various alveoli. There is our dust cell or alveolar macrophage cleaning up any dirt or bacteria that happens to make it way down here. Okay, if we take a blow up right here, we zoom in, here we're going to see our respiratory epithelium, or respiratory membrane. This is the lumen of the alveolus where we have air that has been brought in from the outside and cleaned and purified. Inside here, we have the blood inside our pulmonary capillary. So when gas wants to get from one side to the other, carbon dioxide needs to pass through the plasma membrane of the type 1 alveolar cell, pass through the shared membrane, and then pass through the simple squamous endothelium of the blood vessel, and then it can get into the blood. Likewise, oxygen what did I say here? Oxygen is going to go from the alveolus to blood. I misspoke. I apologize. Well, carbon dioxide needs to be released from the blood, and it will go in the opposite direction. It will pass through the plasma membrane of the endothelium, pass through the basement membrane, pass through the plasma membrane of the type 1 alveolar cell. So carbon dioxide goes from blood to lung so we can exhale it, and oxygen goes from lung to blood so it can be carried to the rest of our cells. So just make sure you get that clear, because I kind of screwed that up a second ago. Oxygen, lung, blood, carbon dioxide, blood to lung. All right, so make sure you understand what the respiratory membrane is. It's a structure made up of three things: the type 1 alveolar cell, a shared basement membrane, and the endothelium of the pulmonary capillary, right? So 2 plasma membranes and 1 shared basement membrane. Gas has got to cross that membrane. You want that membrane to be thin as possibly can to allow for maximum gas exchange, but that thin nature of it makes it very susceptible to infection. In fact, the respiratory route is the most common way pathogens get inside the human body, right? There's just no way around it. It would be nice if we could have a keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium there, because it would keep all the bad stuff out. It would also keep the oxygen out, and then we would suffocate. So here's the compromise, right? We have that long respiratory tract to help clean and purify the air before it gets down to these delicate structures. But even so, right, it's the easiest way for pathogens to get inside of us. And with that, we'll cover a little short chapter in part 3, not chapter, but a short chunk of material in part 3. We'll talk about some of the big structures of the lung. But this middle part was really the biggest and the longest. So you made it through. We'll finish it up next time. Take care.